So thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Barry Erickson, and I'm Community Engagement Coordinator at Wheaton Public Library. Tonight, we are proud to bring you Watergate at 50. Dr. Goldberg teaches political science at College of DuPage, focusing on international relations, U.S. foreign policy, comparative politics, and American politics. He earned his PhD at Northern Illinois University and writes extensively on cooperation among international organizations, election monitoring, and politics in Latin America and the Caribbean. So thank you so much, and join me in welcoming Dr. Goldberg.
Good evening. Thank you, Barry, for the introduction, and Ed for the technical help, and to Wheaton Public Library for the invitation, and also to the Speakers Bureau at COD that does a good job of reaching out to faculty who have some interest and maybe hopefully some knowledge about issues that might be of interest to the larger community, that we're always happy to have these kinds of engagements. So I really appreciate the opportunity to do this live, because while Zoom is certainly life enhancing, it definitely has its limitations. So thank you all, and I appreciate your being here. So I have a unique relationship with Richard Nixon, for which I blame or credit my mother, who sent a birth announcement to the White House in 1969 when I was born. So if you'd like to see it at closer view, I would encourage you to bear this in mind. And she did that for all subsequent presidents when I was a kid. So she would send birthday invitations to children's birthday parties to the White House. So when I was a kid, I had responses from Gerald Ford and Carter all the way up through Ford, and I started that with my own children. Because you get really unique things from the White House. They send great pictures of family pets and other things. And it's an interesting way for people to engage with the White House that has nothing to do with the kinds of things that people might normally associate with the White House. So I am grateful to my mother for introducing me at a very young age to the Nixon White House, that I want to talk to you about tonight a little bit. So I'm going to start off by talking about some of keep the obvious things to a minimum. And then what I really want to talk about are two specific areas where the impact of Watergate continues to resonate in American politics, and particularly in U.S. foreign policy. As the introduction suggested, that's part of something that I'm interested in. So I think that's really important and really powerful beyond some of the obvious things that you might rely on cable and the internet to gain a general overview to things that you may remember or you've read plenty about. So you know that Saturday will be the 50th anniversary of the break-in to the Watergate Hotel. I remember a few decades ago, I had the pleasure of visiting Washington, D.C. in professional capacity. I was at a conference delivering a paper, and I went to the Watergate complex. I hadn't been there before. And I had a martini and toasted to Richard Milhouse Nixon, because I felt like it was an obligation, right, to do that, because it's such a place with such historical resonance. And every scandal involving national politics takes on gate as a suffix now. And we take that for granted, and a lot of people have no real context for that. So I think we sort of take that for granted, what happened at Watergate, the Watergate complex, where a lot of members of Congress and family members rent, and historically that was a place that was quite prestigious. It was also a place where the committee to re-elect the president, the unfortunately named Creep, had authorized a break-in looking for information to the psychiatrist family member of the Democratic National Committee headquarters. And that was the break-in that initially that we will be lamenting or celebrating now, however we wish to put, commemorating would be better, right? Saturday, and recognizing that break-in that has sort of, significantly changed how we think about American politics. And from my perspective, how we think about the presidency, the office of the president, and the executive branch more specifically. And what that means for foreign policy and for campaign finance. So you can see here the committee to re-elect the president. I can say that a few more times and call it CREEP, because what a great acronym, right? I mean, anybody that came up with that has a real sense of a DC or Marvel narrative that they need to write that screenplay that would have that. And I also found out, so I should also shout out to my colleague at College of DuPage, Gary Zidek, who's the assistant news director at WDCB, the public radio station. If you're not availing yourself of the great opportunity that DCB allows you, if you love jazz and a variety of other programming, I had the opportunity to sit down with Gary and talk about what I was going to be talking about here. And Gary told me, I had no idea, many of you probably know this, that Bob Woodward, one of, at the time, a cub reporter for the Washington Post that helped break the story, was from Wheaton. I'm embarrassed to say that I did not know that until last week when I learned that from Gary Zidek, who's a lifelong, grew up in Wheaton and spent a lot of time here, and also told me that the Belushis, I knew this, that the Belushis lived actually down the street from where I live now. So there is a local connection with respect to that. Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein were the sort of cover reporters looking at the crime beat. And if you've seen the movie or read the book, All the President's Men, all of this will be information that you're, painfully aware of. And so they read that crime beat. It was very strange that there were a number of people who were former CIA officers who had broken into the headquarters and what was going on at Watergate. And that raised some attention. That's not the kind of thing that they expected to see when they're looking at sort of garden variety, breaking and entering kind of property crime or violent crime. This breaking at the Watergate Hotel was definitely not what they were looking for. It got their attention, and everything started from there, I would say. And in August of 1974 was the resignation. So between June of 72 and then November of 72, right? The richness of the Watergate scandal is that if you look at a map of the 1972 presidential election, and I did not include this, but I'd be happy to provide a link for anybody. My email's on the other slide. It's very easy to remember. It's Goldberg at cod.edu, my last name. There's a couple good websites that provide good graphics, good visualization of presidential elections. And in 1972, George McGovern, who was the Democratic nominee, won two places. He won Washington, D.C. in his home state. That basically the Nixon campaign was going to win that election no matter what, for a variety of reasons I won't bore you with. Or to put it another way, the felony break-in and the scandal and the cover-up that occurred afterwards was, to say that it was unnecessary is an understatement, right? Like it was a fixation of other people's political psychology, I would say. And I think that's important to bear in mind, is that that's one of the biggest landslides in American political history, what happened in 1972. And it was only later that this came out, and obviously the scandal unfolded. That's it for the beginning of it, because I think what I really want to talk about are these two issues, sort of the campaign finance piece of this, which is very important. And what I think is actually more important are the implications in terms of upsetting the balance of the equilibrium that is supposed to exist between the three branches of government. And Congress has deferred on that, on foreign policy issues, for a very long period of time. And so more of my comments will be about foreign policy than about campaign finance. But I think one of the most tangible legislative initiatives that comes out of Watergate, right, beyond the investigations and everything else, is campaign finance legislation. Because, so the story goes, and it's not a story, it's been verified, when the burglars, the plumbers, as they were called, who were there to fix leaks, were arrested, and this was brought to the White House, and the people around the president and the president himself were very concerned about the possibility that the enormity of the story would emerge. He said, well, let's pay them off, and then proceeded to go to a safe in the White House that had over $1 million in cash. That's problematic, right? For a variety, the $1 million in cash is a problem. That the chief executive allegedly being more than enthusiastic about paying off potential alleged felons. There's a couple pieces that are a problem. I think at its face, though, it creates a problem in terms of being able to track money. And I think this is one of the bigger issues that we face 50 years later. We can debate, and I'll bring this up later on, the First Amendment issues about whether money and speech are synonymous. That's a Supreme Court issue. But I think there's another issue, and that is knowing who's donating money. And I think that that's a fair thing that should not be partisan and is not a constitutional issue. I think the idea that people that donate money, corporations, unions, that make contributions in the hopes of influencing how someone is running for office and what they think about and how they act if they're elected is a fair thing to expect. And that's something that was lacking then and is lacking now for reasons that sort of become obvious. So the Federal Election Campaign Act of 1974 was really one of the first pieces of federal legislation trying to influence and shape, legislate, regulate federal elections that had not existed until that period of time. And so this legislation limited individual contributions to candidates and overall expenditures to $1,000 and $25,000. It seemed like pocket change if you look at the cost of campaigns these days. But nonetheless, this was federal legislation that would limit individuals' abilities to make contributions to both individual candidates and then campaigns. So you could make $1,000 to the candidate of your choice, and then you could make $25,000 overall. So you could divide that up to 24 other candidates, basically. So the idea was to put a hard cap on how much money could be spent by individuals, and then in turn creates political action committees so that corporations and unions would have a legal avenue to make campaign contributions. Because prior to that, they were prohibited by law from doing so, but that didn't stop them, right? It just meant that they were doing so in ways that were less than transparent. And so this was a way to try to make campaign contributions accountable. So you can see the other pieces of this. The other piece of this, the Federal Election Commission, which means that federal campaigns, if you're running for national office, you file quarterly reports, and those are readily available. And you can see the equivalent at the state level that comes out of Springfield. When someone's running for office, they can file a quarterly report. So you can find out how much money, where their money came from. I think that's a fair thing to ask for. Caps might be a different issue, and we can discuss that if you so desire. But I think beyond caps, the idea of where that money comes from is important. Like, for example, we know that foreign contributions are prohibited by federal law. I think there's lots of good reasons why that should exist. But under the current situation and prior to 1974, that would be much more difficult to enforce. It'd be very difficult to find out where that money was coming from. And if people want to make an argument that we should allow money from all corners of the globe, then so be it. Like, that's a conversation to be had as well. But I think it's been sort of an accepted practice that foreign contributions, foreign actors, foreign governments are restricted and should not be allowed to make contributions to federal campaigns. So those are some of the pieces of campaign finance law that came out of that were largely sort of effective, more or less, from the 70s. And then in the early 21st century, there's a sense by John McCain and Russ Feingold. So John McCain, you probably all recall, was a senator from Arizona, and Russ Feingold was a senator from Wisconsin. And they agreed that they thought there was a lot of money in politics that was not transparent, it was not accountable, and that was a problem in a democratic system where accountability and transparency should matter. So as the cost of campaigns exponentially increased, there was more and more of an appetite in Congress, a bipartisan appetite, to have some limitations. And that's what the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act of 2002, so-called McCain-Feingold, is what it's referred to, was supposed to do. It's supposed to limit soft money, because the Federal Election Commission, the FECA, the Federal Election Campaign Act of 74 that I was talking about on the previous slide, only applies to federal elections, right? So at the state level, states make that determination on their own. And this leads to what's called soft money. Hard money is if I give $1,000 to a candidate of my choosing at the federal level, then they report that in their quarterly reports. If I give $500,000 to the local Democratic or Republican or Libertarian or Green Party organization, that's money that no one has to account for. So I could give my federal limits, but then I could give an unlimited, infinite amount of money at the state and local level. And then no one would know where that money was coming from. So that's called soft money. And one of the things that McCain-Feingold was trying to do was trying to limit that. So the other thing that they were trying to do was to have corporations and unions would limit their ads, so-called issue ads. So there's a difference between a campaign ad that says vote for so-and-so versus one that said this is an issue about which you should be concerned, right? And so one of the things that McCain-Feingold was trying to do was to allow issue ads, right, that are not explicitly saying vote for my guy or the other guy stinks, but rather these are issues about which you might be concerned. So that they created a category of so-called issue advocacy. So it could be individuals, corporations, unions, businesses, et cetera, who could come up with their own ads, right? Their own commercials, their own 30-second spots, which, boy, I don't know if your primary is coming up on June 28th, as you're probably hopefully all aware. And governor's primary races, campaigns, commercials I'm seeing more and more of, which I have a professional interest in. Right up until I've had too much. And then I'm like, I'm tired of seeing that ad for the 17th time in the second half of the NBA finals. Please, I don't want to watch that anymore. So the issue advocacy and then the soft money caps were two of the things McCain-Feingold was trying to deal with. So then what happens is, and while Mitch McConnell, a Senate minority leader from Republican from Kentucky, was not the champion of this, he did make some eloquent arguments about this. He began to argue, and this was an argument that was sort of people were latching onto, that if you attempt to limit the amount of money that individuals can give, that's a free speech issue. That's a First Amendment issue, that money is speech. And that if you limit how much money people can give and how much they can play a role in elections, then that's a violation of their First Amendment rights. And that argument came to fruition in 2010 in what has sort of become known as Citizens United, a case about a documentary involving about people that were running against Hillary Clinton or that were going for the other side, or campaigning for the other side. And that ultimately is how Citizens United ruled and said, struck down McCain-Feingold and said, okay, all these attempts to limit how much individuals can give and how much corporations and unions can give are inherently violations of people's First Amendment rights. And then there became an issue of, well, are corporations people? There's this whole other sort of argument about that. I don't want to spend too much time on, because I want to allow as much time as possible for you to ask questions and the people who are joining us on Zoom to have questions as well. So I want to kind of, and as I said before, I think the foreign policy pieces to me are equally important, if not more so, and I'll hopefully explain why. So there's a lot more to this, and PowerPoint is a very limiting medium, right? Sort of go back and forth between the necessity of PowerPoint and the inherent. People's eyelids tend to get heavy somewhere between the 28 and 33 minute mark when it comes to PowerPoint. So I try to be very cognizant of that in my role in the front of the room. So this question about does money equal speech, I think is, something to chew on and something that we can talk about in the question and answer section of the program, if you so desire. That's kind of what I would say about that, is that has opened the door to unlimited amounts of dark money, meaning unlimited amounts of campaign contributions and no one knows where they come from. So again, there's sort of two questions when it comes to campaign finance in the 21st century. Should there be limits on how much people can give? And the Supreme Court has said no, but a lot of other people agree that having some transparency, knowing where that money came from, is something that's important, that under our current system is lacking. So let me move on then to the foreign policy piece of this. I came up with steroids, testosterone. I was really a test run for lots of different ways to sort of talk about how the executive branch has become a lot more muscular. Maybe creatine would be the way to go there, right? The implications of Watergate on the executive branch. What happens after 1974 when Nixon resigns is that Congress does reassert itself and reasserts itself in sort of powerful ways. The War Powers Resolution, which was an attempt to limit the president's ability to put troops in harm's way, to go to war, which is a constitutional conundrum, right? I think this is really important. This is something that I say in my foreign policy class in the very beginning. A lot of the things that we attribute to the current occupant of the White House or people in the House and the Senate are actually things that are baked in the Constitution that have nothing to do with the individual that you like or don't like. They're actually tensions that are inherently in the Constitution because that's what the founders wanted. So, for example, the last time that Congress declared war, this is not a trick question. You probably know the answer. What do you think it is? Anyway, World War II. See, you got it right the first time. 18 to 25-year-olds, they don't always get World War II right off the bat. So it's right. Korea, Vietnam, and on, right, are not declared wars because there's a conflict between Article 1, Section 8 that says only Congress has the power to declare war, and Article 2 that says the president is commander-in-chief of the armed forces. That's a real head scratcher. And it makes sense if you think that the founders wanted going to war to be possible, but not easy. And there are lots of other things that are in the Constitution, super majorities. There are other institutional design issues that are designed to make something possible, but not easy. So removing a president from office is possible, but not easy to do. Filibuster is not even in the Constitution, but that requires a supermajority as well. So I think these institutional design issues should get more of our attention and less the occupant of an office that you agree or disagree with. Because a closer read of these documents mean that the founders wanted Congress and the White House to be in conflict. We shouldn't go to war should not be an easy decision. It should be something that people take seriously, especially elected officials who are making those decisions. So there's this inherent tension that's baked into the system. And I think just that's really important to me, that's a soon to be 250-year-old conundrum about who gets to make this decision. Back to the story of Watergate and the aftermath, what you see is Congress reasserts itself after, depending on how you want to count it, 13 or 15 years, Lyndon Baines Johnson, and some more names on the next slide, and Nixon, the dramatic escalation of the Vietnam War, right, in which 56,000 US citizens lost their life. And that was something that had a legal justification that was pretty thin, right? But I'm sort of jumping ahead of myself here, but I can come back. I'm going to jump around here. I apologize. Oh, second bullet point there is what I'm pretending that I wrote, right? Is that during the national security crisis, the president always gets stronger, right? Let's remember that the Civil War, this is something that should not take anything away from Abraham Lincoln's accomplishments. This is a man who unilaterally, unconstitutionally, got rid of habeas corpus, which is like the centerpiece of the legal system in Roman law in the United States, that you can't detain people without charging them with the crime. Like, that's kind of important, that our system does not allow for the arbitrary detention of people because they don't like the bumper sticker on your car or your haircut or where your parents came from or anything else. That's not allowed. And Lincoln unilaterally, temporarily suspended habeas corpus rights against Confederate soldiers and detained them without charging them with the crime. That was unconstitutional. He argued that it was justifiable because of the Civil War, right? And you may agree with him, right? I think that's important, is that the context in which the threat that was facing the White House was their justification for doing these things. Each one of these cases is a case study in and of itself that historians and political scientists have killed many, many trees to study, right? So there's a lot more ways to sort of look at these things. So Fdr Executive Order 9066, weeks after Pearl Harbor, basically says that all Japanese American citizens have to pack a bag and go live in Idaho for 3 years and not have anything, not have any rights, right? You might argue that that was justified because Japan had attacked the United States. Hawaii is not a part of the United States at the time, but that notwithstanding, the idea that that was an attack on the United States, right? That's understandable. Nonetheless, there's an inherently unconstitutional piece of detaining US citizens for years on end without charging them with a crime, right? So, and then Lyndon Johnson and Nixon, back to my point about, I misspelled Vietnam, for which I apologize. That Lyndon Johnson and Nixon, the escalation of the war, so that back to the War Powers Resolution by 1973, Congress wants to take some of that power back. And they say, yeah, the president can send troops abroad in harm's way, but they got to meet certain criteria. You can only do it for a couple months without congressional approval. Either they got to get the job done or get congressional approval during that period of time. That was their way of saying, we learned a lesson about Vietnam because we basically, Congress defers to the president during a crisis. And you might argue that's justified, right? That it's understandable that the American people, when something happens where the country is attacked, that our interests are threatened, that people lose their lives or the threat of that, that it's just that we expect that the president will take the lead. And there's, some evidence to suggest that's what the founders intended. Not that the president would have wouldn't have unfettered authority, but that he would be able to sort of make some of those arguments. So it is, there's a long historical trail when our country, there's a threat, that presidents become more powerful and skirt or play fast and loose with the law and the Constitution. And maybe it is justifiable, right? That's perhaps a conversation for a different evening. And so then after 9/11, all this gets sort of unmasked and discussed again. Because since 9/11, and to my point about national security and the president getting more powerful, you look at President George W. Bush's approval ratings in the fall of 9/11, he's at 90% approval, right? Suggesting that people are looking for a strong leader, and they thought that he was filling that role at that moment, right? That he was giving people what they wanted, right? So there's a kind of a hunger for safety and security. US voters don't vote on foreign policy, but they do vote on safety and security issues. And I think that's an important distinction. So they're not going to, people don't usually say, I'm voting on this particular issue. There's some exceptions to that, but in general, most voters don't choose foreign policy as the area that they're going to go and cast their vote on. There are ways around that. And so safety and security, if you remember in 2004, when President Bush was running for re-election, there weren't soccer moms anymore. There were security moms who were, that was the demographic that Democrats and Republicans were looking at, that they were paying particular attention to. So security became an issue, that they were concerned about additional domestic terror attacks in the United States. So these are all examples where presidents become more powerful, and at times that's justified, and at times it's excessive, and it comes at a cost. And I think that's something that we should all be aware of. And this is not, I hope that I made this clear, even though I haven't said it up until now. I don't see this as a partisan issue, because as I said, I'm much more interested in the executive branch than who sits there, because that person is only going to be there a few more years, either one, whoever it is. Thankfully, our system allows it's temporary, right? As opposed to, well, I would pick Turkey, Russia, Hungary, Brazil, just to name a few, where there are people that are really comfortable in their offices as president, and they don't seem like they want to give up anytime soon. In our system, that's not the case. So we should focus less on the personalities and the suit color and what internet or social media has to tell us about someone's personal life or this, that. It doesn't matter. This stuff is far more important. The decisions matter. Don't misunderstand me. I just think it's much easier to focus on superficial distractions when we should be focusing on these other issues. And I think the authorization to use military force is one of the more important things that has occurred. Well, let me back up for a second. I'm sorry, because this first bullet point is really important. Dick Cheney, vice president, Donald Rumsfeld, secretary of defense, and I'm missing a few others. We're all in the Nixon administration, right? And so what happened was when Nixon went down and they saw Congress assert itself and the president be sort of, every president be sort of like, when they came back to the White House, they were like, before 9/11, they were like, we have a responsibility in the executive branch to reassert that authority. At this point, this was 9 months before 9/11. This has nothing to do with foreign policy at that point. There were Supreme Court, there were cases, legal cases, litigation about would Vice President Cheney turn over records about who came to visit the vice president. That was the very beginning. It was the very beginning where he said, no, I don't have to give you that. I don't have any obligation to show you that. And as vice president, I have the right to do this. That was for me, when it was like a head scratcher. I was like, oh, they're doing something different. Like they have a different view. They have a different philosophical view about executive power, right? So when the Bush administration came to power, one of their goals was to reassert the authority of the executive branch and push Congress back. Because if it's an equilibrium, they thought that Congress had become too powerful after Nixon and after Watergate, and it was their job to reassert that. And there are lots of examples of that. Domestic, foreign are the ones that I think are occupy my attention more. So that's that first piece in terms of the 21st century that's really important to understand. So Congress doesn't declare war, as we've already discovered here after 9/11. Instead, Congress has passed something called the authorization to use military force. It's a blank check. gives the president the power to go to war, any country, anytime, any place, in the name of combating terrorism. That's a problem. And President Barack Obama, when he was leaving office, said it was a problem. 8 years after he'd used the authorization to use military force, with great, I would argue, reckless abandon in places. But when he was leaving, he said, hey, we got to fix this. The next guy who comes to office, he got to take a look at this, because giving the president a blank check to go to war around the world without any Senate Foreign Relations Committee, without any oversight from the legislature or the judiciary, is flipping the table of the equilibrium, I would argue. That comes to a head with a guy named Anwar al-Awlaki, right? So Anwar al-Awlaki was a US citizen who had a father in the United States and others, who had moved to Yemen and was an al-Qaeda propagandist. Make no mistake, this was someone who was very interested in supporting the aims and goals of al-Qaeda in killing US citizens and affecting US national interest, right? I don't want to be vague about that. I don't want to be ambiguous about that. Clearly, that's what he was. There's no question about that. So at this point, when Obama comes to office, he makes it very clear that he wants to, doesn't want to have more boots in Middle Eastern countries, understandably so. When it comes to the Arab Spring and Syria and some other places, there's a debate between Secretary of State Clinton at the time and the Obama White House and the Obama National Security Team. They're like, yeah, we're not invading any more countries. And Clinton was saying, what about the red line in the sand when Syria uses chemical weapons? There are all these sort of debates around this, right? This is important because Obama says, well, we can use drone strikes. It started under Bush, but they really took off under President Obama, because there's a way from the perspective of the national security state in Washington, D.C. to accomplish goals at a less expensive way. Less meaning money, but also bloodshed. It was $1 million to put a Hellfire missile on an unmanned area, UAV, a drone, and you could accomplish things. You could take out high-value targets, kill people that the United States government felt were planners and plotters and financiers of terror attacks, and do so without having to put Navy SEALs or anyone else on the ground, right? So it would be the CIA would gather that information, gather that intelligence on the ground. They would call out the coordinates, and then the Navy or Air Force branch of government, someone in Vegas, oftentimes it turns out they were the ones that actually had the kill shot, right? So drone strikes became very, very preferred option under the Obama administration. So Anwar al-Awlaki is a U.S. citizen who was not a nice human being, right? So what was happening was that the CIA was presenting the White House with a kill list. These are the list of people that the CIA is recommending that you should kill. And that, I'm not sugarcoating my words here. And Anwar al-Awlaki was on that list. And the Obama administration was in a difficult position, because it's not like you're going to get an extradition treaty in Yemen, which is in the middle of a civil war and is an underdeveloped nation at the end of the Arabian Peninsula that's in the midst of a civil war with Saudi. It's complicated. You're not going to get an extradition treaty with Yemen to get Anwar al-Awlaki. You're going to send in a Navy SEAL team, and it's only going to exacerbate tensions, and you may not even get what you want. So it's certainly understandable why the drone strike was a very attractive option, to go in and kill Anwar al-Awlaki, and also killed several of his children. He was a US citizen. So even though Anwar al-Awlaki was a horrible human being, he was a US citizen. And US presidents do not get to kill US citizens without any oversight. That is not what that Constitution says. That is not what most presidents, members of Congress, courts, and everybody else would agree to. So that is extremely troubling. It does not mitigate the fact the guy was a bad dude. I remember Constitution Day at COD a couple years ago. We had an attorney that had represented John Wayne Gacy had written a book, and he came to speak. The argument was everybody deserves a trial. It wasn't really a question of whether John Wayne Gacy had killed a bunch of people. It was a question of whether he was going to be put to death or not. The point was, even though he basically admitted that he committed mass murder, was a serial killer, he still deserved a fair trial. The worst of the worst still deserve a fair trial. That should be beyond reproach, as far as I'm concerned. It doesn't mean that he's a good guy, right? That any of these people, that's not the point, because the Constitution and the laws that are supposedly governing our system and our way of life are not designed for good people. Because if I had to guess, I would say no one's had to be bailed out and post a lot of money for bond in this room, I would argue, or on this call as well, in the last, I'm going to say couple decades, right? They're not for you and me, because in general, we are people for whom those laws don't, I don't have a problem with the Fourth Amendment. I don't have a problem with the Eighth Amendment. I'm hopefully not going to be up for capital punishment anytime soon. So what is cruel and unusual punishment is not something that I personally have to grapple with in my personal life. My point is, the rules and laws are designed for people, the worst of the worst. And so that's why the killing of Anwar al-Awlaki, while the death may be justified, the mechanism under which it occurs is extremely troubling. And that occurs because of the authorization to use military force. And that occurs because Congress is like, well, 9/11 happened and we're all scared to death. And we trust the White House is going to do the right thing. And we trust the CIA knows how to do their thing. So let's just all say yes and move on, essentially is what Congress did. The courts in some cases actually did stand up when it came to Guantanamo, and there were people that had been detained for years without ever being charged with a crime. 2 of whom were US citizens. I didn't include them here. There were 2 US citizens who were detained at a naval brig in Baltimore for years without being able to see an attorney. Again, these are not, it's a cliche, there's no other way, I'm sure there's a better way to put it. They're not Boy Scouts, they're not Cub Scouts, they're not Webelos, they're none of that, right? They're not great people, but nonetheless, putting US citizens in prison indefinitely, without a day in court, without a call to an attorney, is a big problem, is a big institutional problem where I sit. And that's something that the authorization to use military force allows. And when this came out with Anwar al-Awlaki, the Justice Department, the Obama administration were like, well, we don't really want to talk about it too much. Understandably so. You don't want to reveal sources and methods about things. That's a legitimate argument. It's also an argument that the executive branch has used for decades to justify and cover up some pretty questionable behavior. So there's always a tension here, right? Between they need to do certain things that most people don't know about or don't need to know about, versus is that a justification to do some illegal and unconstitutional things that if people knew about, they might scratch their heads? Things that do not fall neatly along partisan lines, I would argue. So the other piece about the War Powers Resolution was that after 9/11, there were actually bipartisan former secretaries of state, going back to George Shultz, who was a Reagan administration secretary of state, Madeleine Albright, recently deceased, and then others who wrote op-eds in the Washington Post and the New York Times. And they said, we got to redo the War Powers Resolution. We got to find a way to give the president some authority to defend the country when there's a national security attack, but also not give them just unfettered power to do whatever they see fit. That went nowhere, right? Not a lot of support for that. But the idea that the laws that we have are not serving really people's interests, I think, and the idea that the executive branch has no sincere oversight by these other branches in general is not what was intended. It is not what most people expect. And I think that would apply to some presidents as well, you know. But when you're in that office and you get a report from the Director of Central Intelligence every morning, right, with satellite photography and the worst intel that you and I can probably never imagine, I think that has a tendency to change how people view things. I'm not making light of that. I'm just saying these are complicated decisions, and I don't want to make light of that. I also think there's a pattern of behavior here that I think is problematic. So here's the thing when it comes to political science, and this is what my students in international relations, we spend like a month talking about theory, right? Thucydides up to stuff more recent. And I was like, what's the deal with political science? Just want to criticize everything. They don't have any answers. You know, they don't have a blueprint. I'm like, such is existence, right? Like we're not in the business of crafting perfect systems in the international order. Like that's not the goal, to my mind. So the solution part is pretty thin, I'll be honest, right? Because I don't have them. And people that think that there are easier answers and they have easy solutions are people you should run the other way from. Anybody that pretends they know the answers to these things, oh yeah, that's simple, we can fix that. No, not so much. Electoral systems, I would argue, are much easier to fix than anything I'm talking about here, right? Electoral college doesn't work. Proportional representation is a much better system. So there are some areas where I'm happy to wax poetic about what I think are informed opinions about institutions. But when it comes to these kinds of issues, these are complicated and we shouldn't pretend that they're easy. and they come at a cost, a legal cost and a human rights cost. So I think addressing the authorization to use military force, these tension that what I've already said, so I'll only repeat it briefly. The tensions between Congress and the White House are baked into the system. It's not an oversight. It's a feature. It's not a bug. Is really, really important. Two words that don't appear in the Constitution that occupy so much of our political discourse: God and democracy don't occur in the Constitution. Wow, right? So democracy is important because I would argue we are a democracy. And I can take 16 weeks of your life to make the argument why. So I do feel quite strongly that we are a democratic system, and why and how. But I also think it's not a panacea, and it's not a self-regulating system, right? Like the deists, people like Jefferson, who thought, and I'm mixing my metaphors here, that like the best way to explain it to college students that I deal with today is that they were like they thought that God was like a game designer. He wrote the code, right? And then he was like, okay, now let's see what happens, right? That's a very different understanding than how most people, that's what deists believe, right? That's what they thought. That's a very different understanding about than what we associate with the founders. But the point of that being, our system, the Constitution, and I would argue democracy, are not self-regulating. It's not a system that it's not the dishwasher when I go home. And then, so it runs through 3 to 4 different cycles, and the dishes are nice and they're clean and dry when I take them out of the dish. It's not how democracy works, right? And I think that we have a tendency to think that. It's a system that requires that people who are well-intentioned, and that well-intentioned part is really important, I think, that well-intentioned people engage and are active and are respectful of the process and the system and one another. And I don't think respectful civil discourse about serious ideas negates the severity of anything that's going on. I just think it's much easier to yell at people, call each other's names in the chat box, right, than it is to actually deal with issues. And I don't think that serves anybody's purpose, unless you are a shareholder of a major social media company. Then you benefit, right? But in general, most people don't, right? You don't get paid by the chat. You don't get paid by the F-bomb and the insults that people throw at each other. And I think that that's important to bear in mind, is that there are certain commonalities. And I'm almost done here, I promise, but I think I remember telling students in the past that like there was a time when, and I'm not naive or overly in love with bipartisanship and our two-party system, but I think there was a time when people that disagreed fundamentally about profound issues, they could still work together and look at each other and not call each other names and not assume that someone else was scum of the earth and a worm because they disagreed with them. And I think we lose that at our peril, to put it mildly. So I am far flung from Watergate. I don't think that, yeah. So that is what Saturday commemorates to me. The implication of these things 50 years later is that Congress needs to reassert itself, and the courts need to reassert themselves, and the American people need to reassert themselves about foreign policy and what the president can and can't do. And that's also unprecedented because, as I said, the American people don't vote on foreign policy. It just doesn't work that way. And so I don't wish to be unrealistic about what to expect. But I think some of these pieces, like where money comes from, the people that donate tens of millions of dollars, we should know that. We should know that. I think I can argue that with a straight face and not sacrifice my objectivity, to my mind. So there are some things that we should be able to figure out that do not preclude your right to feel strongly about the issues you feel strongly about. So that's my TED Talk. Thanks for coming. Sure. Please just introduce yourself. Tell me your name.
Yeah, my name is Greg. And for mistake,
I'm confused. Yeah, it is. June 17th is Friday. Today is Wednesday. Yeah, that's true. You got me there. The questions? Oh, please, and Carol.
name's Alex. I assume you kind of agree with Chip O'Neill's book, All Politics Are Local.
The title or the substance?
Well, a little of both, where he sort of goes into saying, people yell about democracy, about foreign policy, but they really don't care. He didn't use the Ukraine, but it could be in modern times. We say we care about Ukraine, but we really don't. What we care about is that the safety in our schools for our kids. And why can I afford a new car this year? I really want to get my kitchen done. We talk about it, which would sort of agree with that.
Oh, yeah, for sure. All politics is local. I mean, there's, I don't know if it's in that book or Chris Matthews' Hardball, which I used to use in class before he was a TV personality. He was Tip O'Neill's chief aide. And he wrote some very interesting things in there. And he said those same things. He said, when you have a problem with your garbage pickup, like, you don't call your member of the House or the Senate, right? And when you have a question about foreign policy, you don't call the city council, right? Or your Parks and Rec person, right? So yeah, I think that is important. I do think something like Ukraine, I mean, I could make the argument that I would argue that what that represents does have implications, maybe not local per se, but implications for things that do impact people's lives at the local level. I think that's the way to frame it. Most people can't find Donbass, or when they say Georgia, you're like, yeah, I know it's south of Kentucky and Tennessee. I know where Georgia is, right? It's not the same Georgia. So there's that issue. But I think if people understand that, I think something much greater than that is at stake right now, then that's the way to frame it, rather than, if inflation is this high and the other issues that you raised, why are we sending $40 billion in military assistance to Ukraine? I think, the specifics of that notwithstanding, I think the argument is that what I would argue that Putin is engaged in is something that does affect people in the United States and has the implication to profoundly change things that we've taken for granted for 80 plus years. Carol, I don't know if I answered you. Yeah. Carol.
I'm Carol Sasson. Just a quick question. Could you explain a little bit further about the issue of money and free speech? I didn't quite get that.
So I didn't do what I was asked to do, which was explain Alex's question, which was that Tip O'Neill's book, All Politics is Local. Yeah, was the question, do I agree with it? Yes, very much so. I agree with that. And I have a better appreciation for state and local politics these days than I have for most of my career. So Carol's question was about free speech and money.
Yeah, how it's correlated.
Right. So
I understand. I never thought of it that way. So if you could just explain it, I'd love it. Thank you.
So the argument that the Supreme Court heard and agreed with was that free speech, anything about that's of issue to a lot of people in the public square, essentially, is covered by free speech. And so if you're trying to influence a candidate or a campaign, that's of interest to a lot of people, right? You feel strongly about whatever the issue is. You don't just speak. One way that you speak is putting a yard sign in your front yard, a bumper sticker in your car, wearing a t-shirt, yelling at people on social media, as well as making campaign contributions. And so the argument was that attempts to restrict individual and corporate and union contributions are tantamount to getting people to stop talking, restricting their speech. So what happened at that time was a swing voter who was no longer on the court. The argument was, well, if you get rid of that, there's going to be a much greater conflict of interest. Because if you're running for office and I can give you $10 million tomorrow morning to support my issue, is that not create the appearance of a conflict of interest? And the court basically said, well, appearance is not enough. You got to be able to prove that there's corruption that results from this. And so they were saying simply getting rid of these restrictions and arguing that I'm going to engage in corruption with your campaign is not sufficient to justify it. So then it's then incumbent on the other side to make the argument, well, here's so much corruption. Like, well, geez, that comes at a cost, right? That comes at a price when you have to do that over a long period of time. But that's the core argument. And I hope that I've answered the question, how does speech and money equate in the eyes of the court? That was the argument that Mitch McConnell and Citizens United made to to allow unrestricted campaign contributions. So the soft money, hard money distinctions no longer really matter because people can give unlimited amounts of money and people can do unlimited issue ads. And that's very different than what it was in the past. You're welcome. Other questions? Tell me your name, I'm sorry, and then here.
I don't quite understand the connection between Watergate and what's happened since then.
In my examples or in general, I'm not sure.
Pardon?
The answer was can you restate the question? I'm sorry.
You said, were you indicating that after Watergate, the presidency or the executive branch became stronger?
No, initially Congress pushes back, right? So there's a guy, a historian named Arthur Schlesinger, and he writes a book called The Imperial Presidency. And he criticizes Johnson and Nixon for acting like kings with no restrictions on their power. So after 15 years of war in Southeast Asia, then essentially Congress pushes back. So no, after 1974, Congress pushes back. And then they push back and keep pushing back through Reagan, Bush, all the way up through Clinton, pretty much up until Bush after 9/11, in which that Bush White House says, we are going to strengthen the executive branch. Does that clarification make sense?
I don't see a connection though between Watergate and what happened.
So if Watergate was, among other things, a president unbounded with no real restrictions, then things like the Federal Election Campaign Act of 1974 was an attempt to rein in the excesses of the presidency. The War Powers Resolution on foreign policy is an attempt to rein in that makes more sense? Because I appreciate if you don't, the way I operate is, if you don't understand, that means 10 other people in this room did not understand what I was trying to explain. And you're the only person courageous enough to get up and say, what are you talking about? That doesn't make sense. So I think campaign finance and War Powers Resolution were ways to try to limit the power of the president. You look unconvinced, I'll be honest. Do you want to restate your question or? Okay. Tell me your name.
My name is
Teddy.
Can donations be used for anything?
No, I mean, laws regulate that. Like, you can't use it to pay your credit card bill or your mortgage. Oh, I'm sorry. Teddy's question was, can campaign contributions be used for anything? And no, state and local laws restrict what that money can be used for. So it can't be used for, well, it can't be used for too many things like your credit card bill, but they could be used to pay for a car if you're using that car as part of your campaign. So there are restrictions, and that's a different law that I am not comfortable itemizing for you, but I could point in the right direction.
Can they use them for, say, pay off legal fees?
I think it depends on how those legal fees are accrued, right? I think, and if I see where you're going with this, it might be the manner in which those legal fees were accrued. I do think, and I don't know whether this is a mandate or just ethics, that if you give so the person sitting next to you campaign $1 million and they spend 999,000 of it on legal bills, there should be some disclosure of that, some clarification that that's where you're going to spend that money. But I don't think that's required. Yes, very much so. And there are limits, and there's a state rep race not too far from here in which someone's using money for a car that their opponent is criticizing them for. So there are limitations, but that's not illegal. And that's not quite the same thing where you're going, I think, which is, I think that individual is being criticized and potentially investigated for using money that people donated, they thought for X, that turned out to be for Y. Is that fair? Okay. Other questions?
My name's John. I have a disagreement with something you said earlier about the executive and
the legislative, to me, it's the Supreme Court can overrule no matter what's said. So I think the Supreme Court is the ruling body of this country.
So John was disagreeing with the point that I made earlier about Congress reasserting itself against the executive branch. And if I'm correctly characterizing your comments, John, it was that ultimately that resides with the Supreme Court because they can declare the actions of another branch of government. They can overturn and vacate those, right? So I would say that, yes, that's true. But the Supreme Court has stayed out of the War Powers Resolution. There's things that they don't want to get involved in unless they absolutely have to. So those two cases after 9/11, where there were 2 Americans who were being held in Navy brigs, the court did get involved in that. There were other cases where the Supreme Court did get involved and said that people that were being held at Guantanamo, they don't have the same rights that you and I have, but they do have the right to their day in court to challenge their detention, habeas corpus. So in that case, the Supreme Court did get involved in a foreign policy argument.
What about the Uyghurs who considered innocent that are in Guantanamo?
So Uyghurs, we think about the Chinese minority, religious minority that are ethnically or religiously more likely to be Muslim, that are under a tremendous amount of persecution in China, to put it mildly. You're asking, could you restate your question? I'm not sure.
There are some who are in Guantanamo.
Right.
Uyghurs,
Yes.
that were picked up incorrectly. They were also been given countries that they can go to.
Right.
They can be released for some reason.
The authorization to use military force allows U.S. military intelligence to pick up enemy combatants, so-called, on any field of battle in any country. So if they were Chinese nationals who were accused of supporting Al-Qaeda or some equivalent, that's the legal justification for it. I don't know if you can tell in my voice. I find that extremely problematic. I'm not supporting that, but that is the justification. Their ethnic standing or religious identity in China is of no concern to the people that picked them up and have taken them to Guantanamo Bay. And so how they can challenge their detention, challenging the detention and being released is something else. The third-party countries that have agreed to, and many presidents have done this, basically offered countries money to take Guantanamo Bay detainees. In other words, the countries that they were picked up from said, we don't want them back. There's not enough evidence to actually charge them with the crime and keep them in jail forever, but US military intelligence thinks that they're doing something they shouldn't be doing in the international system in terms of post 9/11 events. And so that's why they detained them for 10, or someone that was released for after 15 years in Guantanamo Bay without ever being charged with the crime. Now, they cannot charge people because to do so at times, it reveals sources and methods of intelligence gathering, right? So again, it's this really tight dynamic, because holding someone for 15 years without charging them with a crime is unconscionable and is something that we associate with authoritarian regimes that do not have the rule of law. And that's a problem. And so that has began to be more of a problem after 9/11, I would say. So yeah, I agree with what you're saying. Other questions here or live, or we're after 8? I don't know how much farther we want to go here. Please.
I had a question.
Hmm?
Hasn't really been touched on, but the presidential power, of course, grows in time of war and conflict. What would you say has been the impact of nuclear weapons since World War II, would require not a deliberative response by Congress that can't seem to, not even school children be murdered in the classroom. What effect has nuclear weapons, the 15 to 30 minutes you have on that, have on presidential power?
The question was, what role have nuclear weapons played in terms of presidential power? That's a really good question. And I'm usually quick to come up with underbaked, undercooked responses on the fly, but I won't burden you with that here tonight. I'm not sure, because when I think of the Cold War, that comes to mind, right? I mean, I think clearly any president's ability to have a tremendous increase in Pentagon spending on a new weapon system, especially during the Cold War when it came to nuclear weapons, put the president in a much bigger, better position. It creates what in political science is called the iron triangle, where you have like, a representative or a senator who's going to be building a new nuclear fleet in their district or in their state suddenly becomes a huge supporter of that. And that means that the president then has authority and leverage and leeway that they may not have had beforehand. So I'm not sure if I'm directly responding to your question, but that's what comes to my mind initially, was that if you look at weapon systems in the Cold War or the Osprey, I had a guy many moons ago, a dissertation director of mine that I TA'd for, and he was doing a lot. His work was on the Osprey, which was a helicopter that would move like a plane, but a plane that would land like a helicopter. And it kept blowing up and people were dying and was not effective. But the people that were funding it and the defense contractors and the members of Congress were just hell bent on making sure the Osprey worked, even though there was no evidence to support that. So those are the kinds of things that come to my mind. I imagine your question actually is a really good one that people have probably done a lot of research on that I'm not familiar with, would be the honest thing for me to say.